Commander Central episode 201, and today we'll be talking about things you need to consider in brewing depending on the amount of colors in your deck. I'm Dana.
And I'm Max.
Max, how's it going today?
Doing great. We're recording on a Friday afternoon. It's warm and sunny here in Wisconsin, so I'm finally kind of getting back to normal, I think.
I am too. I just went for a walk around the neighborhood real quick before we recorded just to kind of get the blood flowing and get some sun in my eyes, and it feels good. Feels like we're finally through the winter, and even though there's a little bit of self-quarantine still happening, it feels like life is at least occurring around me outside. That feels good.
Yeah.
All the trees in my neighborhood are all in full bloom and flowers opening up. Like I've got a lot of lilac bushes in my neighborhood, and those are all starting to open up, so everything smells good outside. So that's good for my mental health.
Totally. I'm super excited to spend some time outside this weekend just because it's supposed to be warm and I can't wait.
Yes. We got a bunch of mulch delivered to put in the flower beds around the house. So a truck came to, and my wife took care of it all because her workload, it's like the last week of school and there's not much left. So she's been just dealing with things like that. So she called and ordered, whatever it was, half a ton of mulch dropped off, which sounds like a lot, but really isn't. So the truck came and she happened to not be home when it came. She had walked down to a friend's house and the two of them were going for a walk. So they knock on the front door and I'm like, oh, mulch, okay. I'm like, just, dump it right there in the driveway. Not thinking, she had a plan already. She's like, well, when they come, I'll make sure to pull the car out of the driveway. I didn't think that through. Luckily, she happened to be walking home as he was backing into the driveway and had to go running up from a block and a half away. Like, don't dump it. Don't. And was able to get the vehicle pulled out of our driveway first before the guy dumped all the mulch out. So granted, we probably could have gotten it distributed to the flower beds appropriately in a couple hours, but now we don't have to do it until Sunday. Whereas we would have had to do it in order to access our one vehicle. So yeah, at least she was paying attention because I certainly wasn't.
Way to go.
That's been my adventure for the week. We actually got to play some games the last couple. You played on Thursday, I think, and I played with EDH Rec, and then we've been playing on the weekends. So we actually have some games we can talk about.
We do. I guess you can go first since you played with EDH Rec Cast this past Wednesday.
I got to fire up my new Timrath the Murder King Infect deck. We had Corbett Hostler on EDH Recast stream. He was a lot of fun to play with. His decks were really pretty evenly matched with ours, and the games were all good. We had some fun plays. I got to, at one point, Corbin swung at Matt with a Gisela Blade of Gold Knight, who's a 5/5, but she doubles damage that's dealt. And I cast a Tainted Strike on Gisela, which gives it +1/+ON Infect. So that would have been 11 Infect damage, which would have killed Matt.
Oh, wow.
and his reaction, first of all, was pretty great, because he's just like, what? You monster? And he had a Force of Will in hand, and he forced it.
Ooh. See, I like all of that, especially the fact that you did a little bit of scumbaggery right there.
I did.
I appreciate that.
And you know what? If you're going to have a spell forced, that's a good one. I felt like I didn't mind that happening at all. And then in another game, the next game, I don't even remember, I played my Talran deck, and Joey was playing the new Greven, who gets +1/+0 whenever you lose life.
Yes.
And he was going to cast a Necropotence, which is, not great, because he's just going to lose as much life as he wants to and then turn Greven into just a one-shot machine. So I went to Swansong it, and in his black-red Greven deck, he had a red Elemental Blast in hand, and he red Elemental Blasted my Swansong.
Very nice, very nice.
Yes. That's one of those plays too, I don't feel bad to lose, having my counterspell countered by Red Elemental Blast. So that was a nice play as well.
Very nice.
How about you?
Yeah, so I, at the spur of the moment last night, got a DM from Lenny Woolley, friend of the show, saying, hey, we need a fourth. Would you mind jumping in? So I fired up my machine and pulled out two Vasa. I ended up playing with Lenny, Brando from CCO, and Chris Von Doom. And did the typical Max fashion at, 10 o'clock at night after having a couple beers. I overextended myself in the game. And on turn 6, I tried to kill Lenny with two Vasa and played right into a Path to Exile. So it happened. I did get a pretty explosive start. It was turn 1, tap land, turn 2, exploration, land, like a land enchantment. Turn 3 was Tuvasa, Sylvan Library, or something like that. I blew up pretty quick. So I deserved it. I overextended.
Sure.
Unfortunately, I did not win that game. Brando won, so you, Brando, you're still undefeated playing EDH on the internet. with everybody, and I just wanted to make sure you knew that.
So the gauntlet has been thrown down. Everyone's just going to try to dethrone Brando now, right?
Yep, and once again, he got to ult a bunch of Planeswalkers. They weren't Dovin Bonds this time. It was Chandra Torture Defiance, so he just got to 5 people in the face every time he cast a spell, and he had like 2 of those emblems, so shame on us for not killing Planeswalkers.
Yeah, I guess. All right, next time you'll take him out, and that way he'll have to say something to you on stream about how, on his podcast about how you're the king.
I mean, they already give me enough crap, so I don't know if that would change anything.
Right, very true. Well, if you've played any fun games in the last week and want to share them with us, how would you do that, Max?
You can hit us up on Twitter at CMDR Central. You can find us on Facebook searching CMDR Central. You can listen to our shows with the awesome graphics on YouTube by searching CMDR Central. And pretty much just Google us and you'll find us.
And, you mentioned those awesome graphics, and we always thank him at the end of the show, but I want to thank him right now, our editor, Rafael Garcia. Find him on Twitter at Ursa Bearwalker. Doing fantastic work, both as an editor and making those graphics, and he's just generally a great guy, so we thank him at the end, but I want to thank him now too, because he's been a really valuable addition to the show.
For sure. Thank you again, Raphael.
You can also find us on flipsidegaming.com.
Yeah, head over there and use promo code CMDR in all caps to get 10% off all orders $10 or more.
We can also be found on patreon.com.
Yeah, search CMDR Central on patreon.com. If you are so inclined to support us financially, we greatly appreciate it. Check out our reward tiers, such as the mini deck tech, which we're about to do today on this show.
All right, let's jump into it here. We have a mini deck tech here from John Egner. You want to read off what John wrote us here, Max?
Yeah, so John provided his Izoni Thousand-Eyed list. He says it's his most favorite and probably the most tuned of all of his deck lists. The theme is to self-mill and fuel his graveyard for a value, and Izoni ETB triggers for future payoffs via Cutthroat, Sir Conrad, and Arya. Weaknesses of the deck is Mass Graveyard Exile and having slower starts depending on the remaining power level of the pod. He has lost a few games to a well-timed Rakdos charm, courtesy of Commander Central local CDM, directly from creature damage or indirectly from Graveyard Exile. The budget for upgrades is roughly $10 a card, and he just is really looking to see what we have to say about his favorite deck.
All right. So for those that don't recall, Izoni Thousand-Eyed is 6 mana for an Elf Shaman, 2 double green, double black. Izoni's a 2/3 and has Undergrowth. Whenever Izoni Thousand-Eyed enters a battlefield, create a 1/1 black and green insect creature token for each creature card in your graveyard. And you can then spend a black or a green at any time to sacrifice another creature, and you gain a life and draw a card. So Izoni's relatively expensive, and the problem I've always kind of had, because I've tried to mentally brew Izoni a few times, it's wanting you to do a bunch of different things that aren't always compatible. It wants you to run a bunch of creatures, but it makes tokens, so it kind of wants you to do token things too, and those don't necessarily go hand in hand.
Yeah, slightly counterintuitive there, in my opinion.
A little bit. But it's also a neat commander, and being able to have a draw effect kind of baked into your commander is pretty useful as well. I got Izoni in one of my packs when we did the draft in Vegas with EDH Rec, where we got to make commander decks out of, it wasn't even a draft, it was like a pre-constructed thing where we had 8 or 10 different packs or something that made a commander deck, and I wound up using, I think, Izoni as my commander. So that's definitely nice having that value engine there, but the deck does fight with itself a little bit. First thing here, what's quick, I want to mention looking at the land base. 36 lands isn't unreasonable, I don't think, necessarily in a 2-color deck. However, there is only 11 basics, which I guess I do plenty often. But I think at 11 basics, you can run, like, Field of the Dead was in this deck at one point in time, I think, because it's in his maybe board. That's enough for Field of the Dead, I think.
Oh, for sure. Especially if you change some of those basics out for snow, just to make sure you trigger Field of the Dead.
Yeah.
Stuff we've said on past shows, but yeah, definitely you have a little more wiggle room, I agree, to slide in a few more extra utility lands.
Like, if there was currently 18 basics in here, I don't think I would suggest changing it down to run Field. I wouldn't say run more utility lands and put Field of the Dead in, but since you're already there, you can just swap a few snow lands in and put Field of the Dead in, and it's going to synergize with what the deck's kind of doing a little bit anyway. It gives you something you can sacrifice, because the sacrifice on Izoni doesn't care what you sacrifice, it just wants you to sacrifice a creature. So it's just that much more fodder for Izoni, it's that much more fodder if you go wide, which I think we're going to suggest a little bit later on. So that's the main card I would add into the land base here. This deck is tricky, though. You kind of mentioned it being somewhat tuned, and it is. So I think we're going to do a little more show and tell than we are just going to flat out recommend a bunch of changes. But I do have a couple of obvious swaps I would suggest here. Under sorceries, for one, he's running Treasured Find right now, which is a 2-mana sorcery. It's a black and a green to return target card from your graveyard to your hand and exile Treasured Find. That's a good card, and I would still run it, or I would run the effect. Regrowth costs 1 and a green, does the same thing, and it doesn't get self-exiled, so you can recur it technically. It's worth running just because it's easier to cast, I think. And if Regrowth was a $10 card, I don't think I would recommend the suggestion, but like you can pick up Regrowth that was just in Mystery Boosters for like 30 cents. 30 cents, I think, just to make it easier to cast and maybe have a chance to recur it if you happen to draw, I don't know what Eternal Witness. I guess I don't know why you'd recur with Eternal Witness, but, if for some reason you have a way to get it back to your hand, you can recur it. But if not, it's something that you could delve away if there's some delve effect you have. I can't remember if there's delve or not in here, but it's something that would give you an option. I guess there is ways to shuffle the graveyard back into your library, so technically you can recur it. I do think, because it's a really, really super cheap upgrade, that's the kind of thing worth doing, I think.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think something to help with the fueling of the graveyard and getting something into your hand, I would recommend Gerard's Orders. It's 4 mana, 2 in Golgari. You search your library for up to 2 creature cards and reveal them. You put 1 into your hand and 1 into the graveyard. You're fueling Izoni. You're getting maybe that win condition creature card that you need to, close out that game. Just a great 4 mana spell for the sorcery slot. And
I know that Izoni has in the commander the ability to sacrifice a creature to gain a life and draw a card. I'd still run Skull Clamp. Number one, even if you have Izoni out, it's a cheaper way to do the same thing. You can clamp those things. I would absolutely sacrifice the life gain because you're not going to gain life off clamp like you do with Izoni, but it's only 1 life. It's not like it's 5 life or something. I would absolutely spend 1 mana less, and it could be a colorless mana on top of it to clamp something to draw 2 cards off Skull Clamp, not just 1. So I think it's absolutely worth having Skull Clamp in here, even though Izoni does a similar thing.
Yeah.
So that would be one I would for sure run in the artifact slot as well. So one of the things we talked about was the deck kind of fighting with itself a little bit. And part of the reason I think that is because it's dependent. You mentioned win conditions being things like Sir Conrad and Ayara, but those are vulnerable to somebody killing your graveyard. And unfortunately in these colors, there's really not a lot of ways to stop. There's no ways basically to stop that.
Right. You're not in blue, so you don't have anything like a stifle or a disallow to maybe, fend off that mass exile of all graveyards or even your graveyard.
Right.
So that makes his main problem extremely hard to solve.
Yes. So I think maybe the one way around that, because you're already a creature deck, there's already a ton of creatures here, and you are making tokens with the commander, assuming you have creatures in play already and have made tokens, if somebody comes and exiles your graveyard, a lot of your plans kind of get flushed down the drain. But if you are running something like a Pathbreaker Ibex or an Overwhelming Stampede or some way to overrun and make those creatures huge and swing in, it gives you a way to then kill people, even if someone takes out your graveyard, assuming you have bodies in play. So I would recommend that as a backup. I would say Crater Hoof too, but that's probably outside of what the budget is for this deck. But I would also suggest saving up for a Crater Hoof for this deck because it would give you, it's just one more way to win in a deck that has all the pieces there already to win using those kind of effects.
Yeah, and there is a Gray Merchant in the maybe board. I know that's not a fun way to win to some people, but
right.
It's also a way to win. I mean, there are a lot of black pips in this deck in the creature package, and even in like the Planeswalker package, there's a lot of double black. I mean, just having Izoni out and casting Gary means you hit everybody for 4 and you're gaining 12. Right. So I definitely think it's worth trying to get that back into the deck just as a win condition.
We can maybe highlight a couple of cards here we want to just point out as being interesting, and I can go first here, Max, because I died to this card fairly recently. That's Morality Shift, old card, I think from Odyssey. No, that's Judgment, I believe. 5 black for a sorcery, so it's pretty expensive. Exchange your graveyard and the library, then shuffle your library.
This feels like a Joey Schultz special.
I mean, yeah, he runs it in his Sir Conrad deck. If Sir Conrad's out, you just kill everyone. Everyone just dies. It's just a 7 mana kill everybody out if Sir Conrad's in play. And Sir Conrad Conrad's always not going to be in play, but it's going to make a ton of tokens if your commander in this deck is in play.
Oh, for sure.
It's a really neat card that's, not good in a lot of decks, but it's great in Conrad, and it's pretty good in this one too, and I wanted to point that one out because I did die to it, and it's not a very frequently played card that it's cool to see it actually in this deck. Any particular ones you want to point out here, Max?
So one of my more interesting cards here is, it's in the enchantment slot, The Binding of the Titans. It's a saga from Theros Beyond Death for 1 and a green. The first chapter says each player puts the top 3 cards of their library into their graveyard. Second chapter is exile up to 2 target cards from graveyards. For each creature card exiled this way, gain 1 life. And then the third chapter is return target creature or land card from your graveyard to your hand. I think this is just super efficient. If you play this on curve, you fuel your graveyard a little. The second chapter, you're going to gain some life, if you've taken some hits already. And then you get something cool back to your hand, like that Gary that maybe you put in the deck, or something huge like a Nyx Weaver or a Fertilid. Yeah. So, it's very efficient. When I originally looked at the list, I'm like, geez, I don't know if this really makes the cut. But the more I look at it, the more I like it.
For 2 mana, it does 3 useful things, and it will also feel bad for somebody else to try to remove.
Right. And, even if it means that second chapter not hitting creatures, you get rid of that spells that Kessler is going to cast again on their turn, exiling something like that. That's super huge in my opinion.
One card I wanted to ask you about, because I think I'm maybe a little bit biased, since I tend to be pretty reckless with my life total. That's Not the Bone is an instant, and it's 2 and green. You gain 2 life for each creature card in your graveyard, then it has flashback for the same cost. So, there's probably times when you're going to gain 20 life off of that for 3 mana. That's really efficient. But I feel like that's just, maybe best case delaying a loss. That's not helping you win, and I feel like this deck wants ways to win.
Yeah, I definitely think this is a card that has very small windows of opportunity to use to get the maximum value out of it.
Right, and then it can get shut off. Like if someone hits your graveyard,
right,
it's just not doing anything.
Or what if they hit your graveyard while it's in there and you don't have the mana to flash it back?
Right.
To be honest, I think I would rather run something like Elixir of Immortality. That's a way to save your graveyard, you gain 5 life, and then you get to redo your whole game plan again, essentially.
Or even just like a fog effect, like a Constant Mists or even plain old fog or something that is going to essentially gain you life in that it's going to stop you from losing life. It might stop or prevent way more damage than you were going to save with Gnaw from the Bone, and it'll work even if your graveyard's empty. So if you really want that effect, I think you're just better off running a fog too, or sudden spoiling even.
Yeah.
Which has a lot of extra utility on top of it.
Oh, for sure. I definitely agree. Fogs, spider spawning, but I think there are probably better cards than Gnaw to the Bone.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. All right. Any final thoughts here before we wrap this up?
I'm not one to play a lot of graveyard shenanigan decks, especially this dedicated. At one point I had a Marin deck, but that's pretty autopilot, I would say.
Sure.
I'm not trying to offend any Marin players out there, but, it's pretty much get experience counters, do your thing. This is a little more, you got to play around a little more, like we said earlier in the deck tech. So this really isn't my forte, but it is definitely a cool deck, and I hope to see it in the wild one day once we can start going to Magic Fests again.
Well, that's a good point. I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this delicately, too, because I know what you're saying. A lot of the graveyard decks are really, really strong that you see commonly, whether it's Marin or Carador or Muldrotha, or even like Teysa Karlov. The things they do are really difficult to overcome, and they are really, really powerful. And Izoni is definitely a step below that, but I respect the attempt to have to, I don't want to say like work at it, because I don't want to imply that you're not working at it playing Marin or Muldrotha or something, but like it requires a lot more something,
right,
whatever that word is, to pilot Izoni and brew Izoni than it does to brew a Marin deck. So I respect the attempt to try to work with a tool that requires you to be a lot more careful with how you pilot it.
Yeah.
And how you brew it than it does maybe say a Marin deck or Muldrotha.
Yeah.
So respect for that, for sure.
Totally agree there. That's a great way to put it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, John, for supporting us on Patreon. We really, really do appreciate it. And anybody else out there who is in Listenerland that can support us on Patreon, we would definitely appreciate that as well. But if you can't, just go ahead and upvote us on YouTube or give us a like on YouTube or iTunes. We would appreciate that. That would go a long ways to helping us out as well. So anything you can do, even in terms of just interaction like that, we appreciate it. And thank you for doing so. Should we jump into the main show here, Max?
Let's do it.
So we're going to talk about the differences at a real kind of high level here, but there are things you need to bear in mind when you brew your deck based on how many colors are in the deck. And this kind of came apparent to me because I just built that 2-color Timurit deck. At the same time I put that together, I had been kind of messing around with Calamax, who's 3 colors. And then right before that, earlier this spring, I had built that 5-color Kenrith the Returned King deck. And just between building 2 and 3 and 5 so close together, it really kind of drew to my attention like how different things are when you're brewing for those the different color configurations. And I'd never really talked about that before or even really thought about it before, so that would make for an interesting show topic. So let's start at the bottom up here and talk about a colorless deck. First of all, because that's the least amount of colors you can build is basically no colors. But neither of us have actually brewed colorless, I don't think. You had talked about Traxos once upon a time, Max, but I don't know if you ever actually put it together.
I never put it together. I started to slowly acquire the pieces for it, and then I think I built Tuvasa instead, to be honest. So I went from colorless
to 3.
Monocolor to 3. And
okay.
The 3 colors being like my wheelhouse. So, I definitely maybe turned the dial back a little bit in difficulty level in my own brewing capabilities.
But we've definitely all played against those colorless decks before. And I've theory crafted it out before myself, kind of thinking about trying to do one. So the first thing we'll point out here is when you are playing in a monocolor deck, you have much more limited choices for things like draw and removal and graveyard recursion because you're dealing primarily with artifacts. There's a few Eldrazi spells or colorless spells, but you're dealing with artifacts and there's a limited amount of things artifacts can do. So your suite of options is much more limited in other colors. It's kind of strange, like colors have restrictions. Colorless doesn't necessarily have restrictions, but it's usually expensive. Like there's artifacts that can destroy permanents, but it tends to cost you like 7 or 8 mana to do it.
Right. Colorless always, to me, like I've played against a Traxos deck, I've played against Kozilek, the Great Distortion.
Yep.
They are definitely more reactive decks, I would say, versus proactive decks. I always feel like they're on the defense until they're ready to get that final kill in on the, the table.
And then you just get hammered.
Yeah.
Particularly in the case of like the Eldrazi, because they're trying to ramp to that point, and oftentimes those decks are running 15 mana rocks or more because they need the mana. But even so, that still oftentimes takes 6 turns to get to that point, to get that 10 or 12 mana. So yeah, no, I would agree with that. Even though their reactions are limited because they have so few options. There's also a limited choice with commanders. There's the Eldrazi that we mentioned, and one of those is banned. So there's 3 Eldrazi. There's 2 versions of each, and in the first Emrakul is banned. So you have 5 Eldrazi that are legal. Beyond that, there's only a couple of artifact commanders. We mentioned Traxos. There's Bosch Iron Golem, but I guess technically Bosch is red because there's red activation cost there.
Yep.
There's Hope of Jiriper, and I think am I missing anything else?
Ramos is technically 5 colors.
Yeah, Ramos is 5 colors.
Golos would be in that same bucket.
Yep.
So yeah, there aren't a lot that are truly colorless, I would say.
A Karn Silver Golem, the 5 mana Karn. So your options are limited in terms of commanders, but that also limits what you can do in terms of like the theme you want to build. I guess all those things limit it, but like if you wanted to build, say, a reanimation deck in colorless, you would have a really tough time doing that. You're not going to be able to build Enchantress in colorless. You're not going to be able to build, you could build artifacts, but you're like, equipment you can do, but you're just much more limited in the scope of what you can do in a colorless deck than you are in anything else. So that's something that you need to think about when you build the deck. Now, I would say ramp is probably easier.
Well, ramp is super easy just because it's mana rocks. That's what every deck tries to make slots for, and in this colorless deck, you have all the slots.
Right.
Up until Oath of the Gatewatch, that was your mana. You didn't have waste. You had to use all the utility lands.
Right.
So you had to stock up on colorless mana rocks. But now that wastes are introduced, you have a little more of a cushion, I would say, for your mana base. And
the colorless makes your color technically, so you don't even have that situation where like sometimes if you're playing a mono deck and you have a bunch of colorless rocks and it's turn 3 and you're like, I need 5 green pips and I only have 3 available. That's not the case here. It's kind of all your quote unquote color being colorless for the most part. So it's maybe, basically outside of green that has land ramp, colorless maybe does ramp better than the other monocolors, I would say.
I would agree with that.
And I would also say, as long as you're not worried about back to basics, like things that actively destroy or turn off utility lands, you probably get hurt less by things like Blood Moon or Quicksilver Fountain Blue that turns lands into islands, turns non-basics into islands. You don't care about that either, because who cares? It's still a colorless, unless you're running like one of the couple cards from Oath of the Gatewatch that specifically need colorless mana. You don't care. Turn them into mountains. That's the same thing to you, functionally. So you almost get hurt less than other decks too by those things that hate colorless, that hate utility lands. So you can afford to, wastes are useful. Maybe you want to have some waste in your deck just so if someone casts a Ruination or something, you're not totally hosed. But you can get away with running probably 20 utility lands of your 35 lands, and it, for the most part, is probably not going to hurt you short of a back to basics.
Yeah, for sure. What I find really interesting is how the game design has kind of changed throughout the years. When you look at some of the older artifact creatures, they're so expensive, and we kind of touched on that earlier. Copperleaf Angel from Prophecy is a 5-mana 2/2 with flying that has sacrifice X lands to put X+1/+1 counters on it. It's so, such high cost, whether the CMC or the ability to make these creatures really good.
Yeah.
And then you move up to current day and you have stuff like Traxos, which is,
right,
a battering ram, if I would say something, or Crystalline Crawler, which for 4 mana and a 1/1 maybe isn't great in a colorless deck, but so that's a terrible example. But you got what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, I know what you're saying for sure. But even things like Scuttling Doom Engine that was in a core set a couple years back was a really decent card for a colorless artifact compared to what you would have got 10 years ago.
I mean, Hangerback Walker,
yeah.
Walking Ballista, all these awesome colorless creatures, and vehicles, if they don't have activated abilities, are colorless, so that's
right.
Another cool inclusion you can put in these type of decks.
Yeah, some of which even serve dual purposes as things like Mana Rock.
Yes.
All right, let's jump over to one colors and talk about that here. Do you actively have any one color decks, monocolor decks, Max?
I do not.
You've had Odric in the past.
I've had Odric, and one of my first, actually, I did that whole trending on Twitter thing, your first 4 commanders,
yep.
which was really hard for me to remember that long ago, but I did have a Nylea God of the Hunt deck for about a year.
That's right. That was kind of your stompy green smash face deck.
I think that was my deck before Dragon Lord Dromoka came out. I changed that to Dromoka.
Okay. I currently have 3 monocolor decks, and in the past I have I've got Dejaru in white, Talrand in blue, and Reki in green. In the past I've had a mono black deck, and I've had mono red a couple times. I've tried, and I eventually will make them. So I do like monocolor decks. So I have some experience here to talk about this, and of course we've played against plenty of these. Lands get interesting here. In theory you have plenty of room to run utility lands because you only need to make one color, so you're hurt way less. You don't have that situation where you just accidentally draw 3 utility lands and you need both your colors and can't do anything. As long as you have 1 or 2 basics, you're probably good to go. Except that in monocolor, there's a lot of things you can do that take advantage of basics. Black has Cabal Coffers or Cabal Stronghold. Green has Vernal Bloom, Early Harvest, things like Primal Order that hurt other people for running utility lands. Blue has High Tide, which doubles the mana off basics. We mentioned Back to Basics and Quicksilver Fountain that hurt people for not running islands. Red has Blood Moon, Magus the Moon, Ruination, Valkut that cares about you running mountains, and there's things like Extraplanar Lens or Caged Sun or Gauntlet of Power in all colors that care about you having basics to double the mana you make too. So you kind of have to then decide, do you want to run a ton of basics and then take advantage of those things in your color that are going to reward you for running basics, or do you want to take advantage of the fact that you can afford to run a ton of utility lands?
Mm-hmm.
Did you prefer one way or the other when you played your monocolor decks?
When I had Nylea, there weren't a lot of good utility lands out at the time. I think there's been a lot more since then, because that was back when I kind of first started playing EDH. If I were to build a monocolor deck now, I think I definitely would lean more into the utility lands just because I know how to use them. I know that kind of sounds dumb, but I get the value of them. Sure. I understand why they're good versus just slapping, 30 forests into a mono green deck, add a reliquary tower, add maybe a ghost quarter and a strip mine, and you're good. But now there's so many more that you could just add just to help your deck out. Field of the Dead. We talked about that during the deck tech. There's more land destruction lands. There's, the graft lands. There's so many lands that do more that in a monocolor deck, why not run them? if they're going to either produce your color or help with your overall strategy.
In the 3 decks I'm currently running, they're decks that tend to want to use a ton of mana. My Talran deck, because of the way it works, it's, cast a cantrip to draw a card, to cast a cantrip to draw a card. It will use up all the mana I have available. So in that particular deck, it's useful to have a ton of mana, and therefore I lean heavily into the basics so I can run the Caged Sun, Extraplanar Lens kind of thing. Same thing's true in Reki because of the way it works. Similarly, I'll cast a creature to draw a card, to cast a creature to draw a card. That will use up most of the mana as well. And even though it doesn't work that way in Jiru, because it plays Planeswalkers, they just tend to be mana hungry to begin with. And because when Jiru gets cast, he lets me go get a Planeswalker, and I have ways to blink him or bounce him or do whatever, I tend to use the mana up in that deck too. So it just so happens the 3 decks I currently have are ones that can take more advantage of being able to double my mana off some of those effects than it would be to run extra utility lands. But I think maybe in mono red or something, for example, I think red I would probably lean more into the more utility lands there, because just the way red works, I don't know if you need the mana quite as much as you do in other colors. I guess it depends on the deck, but you definitely, I think, kind of need to make a choice. And it just so happens for me, the choice has been in the mono decks I run to lean into the doublers, but it can go either way. Monocolored decks are where the color pie weaknesses really show up. And we mentioned this in colorless a little bit, but it's definitely something that stands out here. And, we talked about having to choose between running a bunch of utility lands or a bunch of basics, depending on what you want to do. The same thing's very much true here. You need to decide, are you going to use a subpar solution for your color's weaknesses, or are you just going to ignore those weaknesses? So, for example, if your color doesn't have ways to remove artifacts or enchantments, black. So you're playing black and you can't deal with artifacts or enchantments. Do you want to just not care? And you're like, well, I just can't deal with artifacts and enchantments, and that's what it is. Or do you want to run like Spine of Isha or Unstable Obelisk and have them there and be willing to spend 7 mana or something to destroy a doubling season if you need to? Do you have a choice there, Max? Do you prefer to use the not ideal answer, or do you just want to shrug and say, I guess I might just sometimes die to an artifact that I can't stop, and that's just what it is?
I think you have to lean into the weakness and just say, I know I can't deal with this, so I just need to put more resources into the way I want to win. So if you're a mono black deck and you got to deal with that doubling season deck, maybe you run Dictate of Erebos or Grave Pact, so as fast as they can make tokens, you can probably make tokens just as fast in mono black. But
yeah,
you can you have sacrifice outlets, and you can make sure for every token they make, you can make them sacrifice it essentially. Black plays a lot with the life swap stuff. Granted, black-white does it better, but, Grey Merchant or Asphodel, you have Blood Artist, Zulaport Cutthroat. You can build that Aristocrats package into that deck just to kind of maybe stem the bleeding of those faster decks that have enchantments and artifacts that you can't deal with.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I've kind of changed on this over the years. I think the first monocolor deck I built was my mono black one. And I did run, I think that was right when Unstable Obelisk came out. And so I mentioned that in particular. I think I had Unstable Obelisk in there, and then I think when Scour from Existence came out, I put that in the deck as well. So at the time, I did run these subpar solutions. Today, I don't think I would, and I don't in some of my decks. I do take I can't deal with that, and I have to hope somebody else can, or I'll just kill the person who's the problem.
There you go.
So I've kind of changed around that as well. But I don't think either one of those, I don't think that's necessarily the right answer, but I do think people do kind of need to be aware that you have to, for the most part, make a decision on that. One thing nice in mono decks, you can run things that interact or hate on a specific color or lack of a color very easily. I was thinking of Mass Calcified mono white destroys all non-white creatures. It's just not going to touch you. So that becomes a very good card in a mono white deck. Or Inundate in blue that bounces all non-blue creatures to their owner's hands. Well, hey, I'm playing mono blue. It's not going to touch any of my stuff, and it's going to, just as a value engine, hit everybody else pretty hard. Washout you can run in other color decks just because you pick the color. But again, it's much easier to cast a washout in your mono blue deck, where you're going to pick, odds are 4 to 5 times, pick a color that's not blue and not get touched.
Right. See, I don't know how I feel about these. All of these colors, minus Washout, because Washout's 4 mana. I think it's 3 and a blue.
Yeah.
But Inundate is 6 mana with
It's
triple
expensive.
blue.
You bet.
And, we're talking mono color decks, so it's not like you're trying to fix your mana to make sure you have trip blue. The Mass Calcify is the one I used to run in my Odric deck, but I always just wanted that Wrath on turn 4, not turn 5 or 6, whatever Mass Calcify is. I think it's 5. No, it's 6.
It's 6. But that's a good point, because sometimes you have situations where you think, okay, Mass Calcify, I'm going to get really good value, and you look around and you're like, oh, Max is playing Dragonlord Jamoka, which happens to be a white creature because it's green and blue, and somebody else is playing a 3-color deck, but it's a Naya deck, so it also happens to be white. It's one of those cards that sometimes winds up not being nearly as one-sided as it looks like it's going to be.
Yeah, I have definitely found, specifically in our local meta, these type of cards tend to be dead cards in my hand because our meta do play a lot of multicolor decks. So
yes,
casting Mass Calcify might take care of the second biggest problem at the table, but it's not going to take care of the biggest problem at the table, where a standard Wrath or Rift or something like that is going to take care of everything. And you know what? I'm okay with destroying a couple of my things if it means knocking the person that is way ahead of all of us back to kind of the beginning with us.
Oh, absolutely. The last one we will mention here, I'm going to say, is Devotion really, really shines in a monocolor deck. Man, Nykthos in almost any monocolor deck is going to be just a absolute bomb, whereas things like Chroma and Converge tend to be pretty terrible in monocolor decks. So just wanted to mention that because Nykthos is absolutely a star in mono decks, and I would have a tough time not running it in almost any deck I built that's just one color.
Totally agree there.
Let's jump over to 2 colors, which I think is both our sweet spot.
If it isn't, then I think I don't know how I play Magic.
So why is it that you like 2-color decks? Do you know? Have you thought about it?
Yes, I like 2-color decks because the 2 colors that I want to play each do interesting things that I like to do. So Dramoka, green ramps, white has a lot of cool creatures, are the life gain stuff. Brago, blue has the control magic stuff, the counter magic, all that stuff. White has removal. So it's a good control deck. It's just each color kind of plays into a strength in my magic, up trick that I can do in this game. And combining the two to complement each other just plays into how I like to play the game.
Yeah, I'm pretty much with you there. And it's really easy to visualize what the color pairs do, at least for me. When you talk about Selesnya, I know what a Selesnya deck is going to kind of look like and what it's going to feel like, if that makes sense. Versus a 3-color deck, it tends to be much more nebulous, at least to me. Maybe that's not true for everybody, but I don't have such a specific feel about what a 3-color deck is going to feel like I do with a 2-color deck. And to me, I like that.
You make a great point there. I think in 2 colors, there are enough legendary creatures in 2 colors where if you want to play this, Selesnya commander that maybe says tokens, but you don't want to make it tokens, you don't have to play that commander that way. Granted, I'm not the best 3-color deck builder in the world, and I only have one 3-color deck, but most what I've found, and that's been the struggle for me with 3 colors, is all those commanders pretty much say, you should really do this to get the most value out of the commander, where I don't feel that way with 2-color generals. Like Dragonlord Jamoka says flying and lifelink. Well, I could just build a lifelink deck, but no, I went all flying tribal. Miri the Cat Warrior is that Weatherlight Captain. Ooh, Matt Morgan's gonna get mad at me for forgetting that. That's all about combat, but it could be little dudes, it could be big dudes. It's very flexible in my opinion.
Sure. So the first thing here we'll talk about is lands again. This is kind of a sweet spot, I think, for lands too. It's fairly easy to build a diverse land base that hits both of your colors, while you can also still have plenty of basics. So you can have a good amount of basics, you can have a good amount of utility lands and a good amount of duels, and you can distribute that really easily in a 2-color deck. And I think from this point on, that gets way trickier. And we talked about color pie weaknesses in monocolor decks. It's much easier in a 2-color deck to have the colors pick up for each other. That's not always true. Rakdos can't deal with enchantments. Dimir can't deal with artifacts or enchantments. But for the most part, there's something in each color that covers for the weaknesses of another color. In a 2-color deck, you tend to also not need to worry too much about your mana costs. I mean, you do a little bit, like True Conviction in a 2-color white deck. Triple white on it is not ideal, but for the most part, by the time you want to cast True Conviction anyway, you can probably make triple white. And I think that definitely is much harder to say in a 3-color deck. But in a 2-color deck, you can make it happen.
Oh, for sure. And when you get into the 2 plus color decks, you have tools to help you make sure you can do that. So there's Chromatic Lantern, which, I run in a couple of my 2-color decks just because they aren't green. So it helps to fix my mana. In green, you have like Dryad of Elysian Grove that makes sure you can tap your lands for any color. So there are cards you maybe wouldn't run in a monocolor deck that you now have access to help with the color fixing in your 2-color, 3-color decks, 4-color decks, and so on.
But in a 2-color deck is probably the place where you need them the least. So it does free up some slots, kind of, not have to worry about that like you do in a 3-color deck. A couple of the lands we talked about here too. This is really the last place you can probably run Nykthos, and it's not nearly as good, but I do run Nykthos in 2-color decks, and it's usually fine. It's usually something that taps for, 3 or 4 mana versus 8 or 10. That's still pretty decent.
Oh, for sure. I run it in one of my 2-color decks just because all the creatures have at least 1, if not 2 pips of the color I'm going to be needing.
Same thing for Cabal Coffers. Cabal Coffers is much tougher to make work, but you can run Cabal Coffers in a 2-color deck. You can find enough mountains to have Valkut do work in a 2-color deck. After this, though, once we get to 3 colors, all 3 of those lands probably are no longer playable.
Definitely, I would agree with that. Unless you really tune your mana base to make unless
you're specifically doing a thing that's built to do that. So let's jump over to 3 colors. Now we're getting a little bit more nebulous territory for the two of us, although we both do have 3-color decks and have built them. The land base gets much trickier here. Here's where it's hard to balance out the color fixing you need from dual lands and utility lands that do the utility that you want while still having a certain amount of basics in the deck. I really struggle in a 3-color deck doing this.
Yeah, same here. I'm actually looking at my Tuvasa deck list right now as reference. I think I run 2 utility lands in that entire deck. Everything else produces the colors I need to make that deck go.
Yeah, it gets way harder. And and I feel like 3 colors where you really need to then start putting in the lands that make all 3 colors, things like City of Brass or Mana Confluence. This is where you really need to, like, Chromatic Lantern goes from a situation where you're like, oh, I don't require enough colorless pips that I care, to in a 3-color deck, at least for me, I now have to think, man, I really want Chromatic Lantern, or I really want, what's the new creature? You just mentioned it.
Dryad of the Elysian Grove.
Dryad of the Elysian Grove, or like Prismatic Omen or something. Like, I really feel like at that point, I want those kind of effects to hit my colors. Particularly if you're not running like a perfect mana base with, the fetches and the ABUR duels and everything. It becomes way trickier in 3 colors.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Even things like even the colorless pips here, like we talked about True Conviction. True Conviction gets really hard in a 3-color deck, but double pips sometimes gets tricky, like double blue on a counterspell, particularly if you need to even spend 1 blue mana main phase and then need to save 2 for counterspell. That gets really hard in the 3-color deck.
Yeah, this is something I struggle with when I build my 3-color deck. Says, okay, so we'll take something like Bear Umbra. It's double green in a deck that isn't, my Tuvasa deck isn't very heavy green. It's mainly white and blue. How often am I going to have double green to make sure I can cast that when I want to? Or is it just going to sit in my hand for X amount of turns?
Now, luckily, like Bear Umbra, I guess, is probably a bad example because it untaps your lands when you deal damage. But
nobody needs to know that.
But think of like anything else that costs double green in a deck that doesn't have a ton of green mana producers. Then that's going to use up anything else you want to do, or assuming you even have the mana in the first place.
Right.
Yeah, it really gets, the mana management gets way trickier in a 3-color deck and requires you to really pay attention. At least it does for me.
Yeah, I think anything above 2 becomes, you really need to manage your resources well.
Colorless mana gets way worse in a 3-color deck. Not that Soul Ring's not still good, but you definitely get in positions with colorless mana where you're like, oh man, this Ancient Tomb I still run Ancient Tomb in my 3-color deck, but there's plenty of times I take 2 damage from it just to use the 1 colorless mana because I don't have another way to use the other colorless because I'm doing so many colored things that it's just not as easy to sink that mana as it is in a 2 or 1 color deck.
Yeah, in my 3-color decks, I've moved away from something like Ancient Tomb, although it's an amazing card and is probably great in the mid to late game, but I would much rather prefer running the Painlands over something like Ancient Tomb because they can produce the color I need for a hit on my life, or it still produces that single colorless pip you might need for something.
Well, especially in like your Tuvasa deck where it requires no colorless mana and 1 of each colored.
Right.
Now, a plus here, in a 3-color deck, you can usually feel like odds are all your weaknesses get covered.
I would hope so.
Exception is maybe Grixis, I guess, still can't deal with enchantments, is probably the one.
There are some bounce spells that bounce permanents, aren't there?
You do have bounce even in Grixis, and you do have, obviously, Chaos Warp is the exception to every rule. So you do have some things, but for the most part, in a 3-color deck, you can assume you're going to have answers to almost any problem. So that is nice. I guess the counter to that, though, is 3 is where things get really, really difficult for me to make cuts. Like when I build a 2-color deck, my first pass when I'm putting cards in the list, I get to like 115 or something. And yeah, those last couple cuts get difficult to make, but it's pretty easy to start like throwing things away. Like, okay, don't need this, don't need this, don't need this. And it's relatively easy to get down. Whenever I've tried to build a 3 or more color deck, I wind up at like 140 cards for that first pass. And I'm like, okay. And then I spend an hour like, okay, maybe not this, maybe not this. Spend an hour pruning it and I'm down to like 136. I'm like, come on. Because I wind up adding, as I'm removing cards, I'm like, well, yeah, well, this would be good too. It becomes way more difficult, at least for me, to pull things out because there's just so many good options.
Yeah, especially when you're playing like the 3 colors you love to play the most.
Yeah.
So like when I built Tuvasa, I knew I wanted to do enchantments, so like I could weed out any artifacts, but it was really hard to be like, oh, I want to make room for more counter spells or more removal like Generous Gift and Beast Within, but then I'm hitting the main theme of the deck, and then there's all these other cool enchantments I want to play, and it gets tough. Yeah, I went through that same process. You start at 150, go up to 170, then down to 120 and 98 for a while. I don't know how that happened, and then...
But some other effects, things like this is where at this point now devotion becomes probably just a non-factor. Nykthos is not playable. Almost anything that cares about devotion probably isn't good anymore. I mean, maybe Gary can still work, but for the most part, devotion's just no longer a factor. Whereas things like Converge and Chroma get way, way better. Painful Truths in a 3-color deck playing black, a 3-mana draw 3 is really, really good.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, it definitely is a weird flex on what becomes good when you get past the 2-color mark.
Yep. Anything final here for 3 colors before we move on?
I don't like it. I don't like 3-color decks, but I'm trying to get better.
I have been working at it as well. It's definitely not my comfort zone. But if that isn't, 4 and 5 color definitely isn't, which is where we'll go next. And we'll kind of lump these together because I don't think there's much difference between brewing between 4 or 5 colors. So I have one 5-color deck, and it's my newest deck, which is that Kenrith, the Returned King deck. I don't think you've ever built a 5-color deck, have you, Max?
I have not, but I am starting one.
What are you starting?
I am going to build an Ur-Dragon deck because I want something kind of fun and stompy.
Okay,
and
cool.
I was lucky enough, Rafael Garcia had a spare one from the Kaleidoscope Killer's Secret Lair, so we did a little trading and should hopefully have the card in the next couple weeks.
That guy does it all.
He does it all.
So effects that make a random color are really, really good here, and I think I actually had that in the notes and we skipped it on 3 colors. Things like Felwar Stone and Exotic Orchard that produce a color of mana your opponents can produce. In a 3-color deck, get much, much better. In a 4 or 5-color deck, they're just always going to make a color you can use. Maybe it isn't the exact color you need, but it's always going to be a useful color. So those things get way, way better in 4 or 5 colors. But the one that really jumped out at me here, fetches and ABUR duels and shocklands are way more important here. They're important in 3-color decks. They are ridiculously important in a 4 and 5-color deck. To use Flooded Strand for an example, Flooded Strand is a fetch land that can get an island or a plane. If you're running particularly a shockland because it can come into play untapped or an ABUR duel, the island half of Flooded Strand can get you a tundra or a volcanic island, a tropical island or an underground sea, or the shockland equivalent of those. The plane half of it can get you a tundra, a plateau, a scrubland, or a savanna. So basically a single fetch land, and this applies to all 10 fetch lands, can get you literally every one color you need. And it can get you 6 of the 10 2 colors you need. So a single fetch should solve almost any fixing you have that you need from your deck, assuming you have the appropriate shock or ABR duels in those decks. And that is huge in those decks. And I really notice it in my Kenrith deck where I'm not running fetches and I'm not running ABUR duels. I do have shocks in there, but like the color fixing for that deck is much more difficult than it would be if I happen to have the perfect mana base. You can get away with a not perfect mana base in a 2 or 3 color deck and not probably feel it too badly. especially, it makes a huge difference in 4 or 5.
Yeah.
And we have triomes now, which have 3 types, which just make those fetches even that much better in a 5-color deck or 4-color deck.
Yeah, definitely. I think, though, like, we talked about this in the 3-color deck, this is where your utility lands are barely available.
Yes, you
I
bet.
mean, going on the fact that you want all 10 shocks, you want maybe the check lands, so like your Dragon Skull Summits, your Hinterland Harbors, you want all 10 of those, so there's 20 of your 38 lands.
Yeah.
Well, you need basics, because what if you play in a back to basics meta or a Blood Moon, so you probably want 3 of every basic, so there's another 15 cards. Well, now you're at 35 of your 38 to 40 lands.
Throw a couple of strip mine kind of effects in there and that's it. You're done.
Yeah, I mean, personally speaking for probably both of us, we need to find a room for a reliquary tower.
Yeah.
So now
scavenger grounds and your strip mine and tectonic edge or something and you're done. That's it.
Yeah. So this is definitely where I think you just go into the fact knowing that you aren't going to be able to deal with, a Maze of Ith or a Glacial Chasm. You just have to hope someone else does for you.
Yep. Well, in talking with that, like, and that's thousands of dollars in lands. The fetch lands, shock lands, and ABUR duels. But even removing the ABUR duels, even if you're just talking shocks and fetches, that's still probably that's well over $1,000. And even if you're just talking shocks, even just the suite of 10 shocks alone is well over $100.
Yeah.
So you can build an effective land base in 1 or 2 colors for really, really cheap. To build an effective land base in a 4 or 5 color deck, it's expensive. It's expensive for the budget version of it, let alone a really good version of it.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of sticker shock there. Like I didn't want to come across as being dismissive of that price tag. That price tag is crazy to make it work effectively. And if you don't and you go with the budget version, you really feel it in a way you don't in other colors.
Yeah, and I think that statement also though depends on the meta. If you play with the same 4 people and you all build 5-color decks, and maybe you run the cycling lands from Amonkhet block and you run the check lands from Ixalan/Corsets and the few shocks you have because they were just reprinted. Cool. You're all playing at the same power level, but if you were to take that mana base and walk into a Magic Fest and sit down with your 5-color deck, you probably are gonna start feeling that like, oh geez, I need a better land base.
You bet.
We are not saying go out and buy ABUR duels. That's what I'm trying to say.
Because I didn't. Like I absolutely I did not for my Kenrith deck. And I think the only reason I have the shocks in there is because I happen to have them from back in Return to Ravnica or ones that I picked up in the last Ravnica set. So I happen to have shocks in my collection from playing F&Ms and that kind of thing. But if I wouldn't have, I don't know if I would have gone out and spent that money on them. So yeah, absolutely. On the positive here, you have all the choices. You have all the things. You have access basically to every card in 5-color and most of them in 4-color. So anything you want to run to solve a problem is there.
See, I agree with that. I agree. You have all the choices because you're in all 5 colors. I think it also is slightly a negative, though, because...
Oh, it's overwhelming, for sure.
It's very overwhelming because what do you do? Oh, I know my meta, is heavy in targeted removal spells. So let's say I'm building my 5-color deck with 40 lands. I'm just going to use that number. Okay, I have 59 more slots. How many of those do I put for removal because I know I need it? Or do I just go ham and build, well, if I'm building the Ur Dragon, I just want all the dragons I can get and cards that support dragons and just say, well, I'll run a couple Wraths, but I'm not going to run, all the targeted removal I normally would run in a 2-color or even maybe a 3-color deck.
In the things that get cut, the standards change too, right? So like generally speaking, if I'm playing a 2-color deck that has green in it, I'm gonna run Beast Within. If I'm playing a 2-color deck with white, I'm gonna be running Generous Gift and Path to Exile and Swords to Plowshare. So I'm playing a 2-color deck with red, I'm running probably Chaos Warp. Or if I'm playing, with blue, probably Reality Shift. You can't run all of those. If I'm playing a 2-color deck, I would run them, but in a 5-color deck, I can't run all of them. There isn't room for all of those cards. In addition to, Anguish Unmaking or Utter End or Vindicate or Assassin's Trophy or whatever. Like same thing with board wipes. If I'm playing white, I'm probably going to run, Wrath of God or Austere Command. A couple of board wipes. If I'm playing red, I'm going to probably run Chandra's Ignition or Blasphemous Act, Deluge in black, whatever. I'm not going to run 12 board wipes that in a 5-color deck that you would think you would normally run in those color pairs. So the things that make a card no longer make the cut in 5 colors is way different than it is in 2 colors.
Yeah, for sure. It definitely is dependent on where you play the most, I think, and what power level you want the deck at. Yep. But yeah, you got to make tough cuts and determine what's most efficient for what you want the deck to do.
And that feels bad for me. I really struggled with Kenrith for that, figuring out things like board wipes, ones that I would normally just assume I'm always going to run. That math suddenly changes when there's suddenly 10 of those that I, quote unquote, would always run.
Yeah.
Utility lands and mana rocks that make colorless mana get way harder to run here as well. I mentioned Ancient Tomb, but the same kind of applies to, again, I would still probably run Sol Ring, but Sol Ring becomes less useful in a 5-color deck than it is in a 2-color deck because that colorless mana is just less valuable here.
Yeah, this is definitely where I think stuff like Arcane Signet, you said Felwar Stone, stuff like that really shines in your 4 and 5 color decks because you're always going to be able to produce the colors you need.
You bet. Yep.
Signets or even talismans kind of do better here, although maybe not. How do you want to devote 5 slots for mana rocks? I don't know.
Right, yeah, that becomes tricky too because now you have green too. So
right.
How much green do I run? That kind of thing, the green ramp. So yeah, that becomes interesting, the math there. Mana pips now become a huge deal. We talked about a little bit for 3-color, but like True Conviction, which we mentioned, Gratuitous Violence, which is trip red, Archmage's Charm, which is trip blue. Those things almost become unplayable in a 5-color deck or 4-color deck even.
Yeah, I mean, not even just those things with trip pips, but like something like Izoni, double of 2 colors is tough. I think some cards that are just like double black probably are okay because you're going to fetch for the colors you need or you have an Arcane Signet out, but like when you start stacking, 2 of one color and a third pip of something else, or double pips, it's rough.
Yeah. My final note here on this, and this is something that I missed a lot of when I built my Kenrith deck. Well, maybe I'm glad I did because it's stuff I don't have to cut now. Is there's a lot of weird 3-color cards out there that, at least mentally myself, I think only in terms of them being a 3-color deck. So I'll use Guided Passage for an example, which is a way to basically let your opponent search your library for 3 cards and give them to you for 3 mana. And it's in, it's green, blue...
Teamer.
It's in Teamer colors. Yeah, it's in Teamer colors. But I think that is a Teamer card. But like that's playable in, a bunch of 4-color decks and every 5-color deck. But mentally, I don't think of that. I think of it as a Teamer card and I would play it on a Teamer deck, but that's perfectly legal in a 5-color deck. So I think it's easy to, 5 colors, there's so many options going on there. It's easy to miss out on those 3-color cards that you associate with a 3-color deck that technically do work in a 5-color deck. Like you're not really missing out on things in a 2-color deck. There's not stuff you can kind of forget, but I think in a 5-color deck you can because you have access to everything.
And that's actually the problem is you have access to everything.
It absolutely is for me. So, all right. Well, I'm looking forward to seeing this Ur-Dragon deck of yours and see how you and hear about how it goes for you to brew a 5-color deck since it's way outside of your wheelhouse because I definitely struggled with Kenrith for sure.
I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm already intimidated because I sort of forgot about that land base issue and I know I don't have many extra shocks and I have 0 fetches, so don't expect it anytime soon. This might be like my first deck of next year.
I kind of take it for granted a little bit because we played pretty heavily during Cons block. So you and I and Chris as well all tended to have at least those 5 shock lands in surplus because we played during that set. So like we had a lot of those lands just lying around. And in the years since then, whenever I've built a deck, I've just been like, I'll just go grab a Flooded Strand out of inventory that I had from back then. I'll grab a Windswept Heath out of inventory. At this point now, my inventory's dried up. I've built enough decks and enough time has passed. I no longer can just casually go grab a Polluted Delta out of the box that I had lying around since Cons. So now it's become real. I need to actually look at, oh man, how much is that card and I have to go buy it? Maybe I can find a replacement.
Yeah, I'm not looking forward to that, but I'll deal with it when it comes.
All right, that is going to wrap up episode 201. I hope that was useful for you out there in listener land. Want to thank our editor, Rafael Garcia, who also trades cards to Max, apparently.
Oh, yeah.
So thank you again, Rafael. You can find him on Twitter at Ursa Bearwalker. You can find me on Twitter at Dana Roach. You can find Max at CMDRCentral_Max. And you can find Chris at WiseSquishy1. Our podcast theme is Retro Future Dirty by Kevin MacLeod, licensed via Creative Commons. And we will be back on Thursday with another deck tech. Until then, I'm Dana.
And I'm Max.